Heads up. Got it. Thanks again, Leanne. I'm going to attempt this morning an argument that an understanding of what strategic communication really is can empower rarely heard voices to make a significant impact on the public discourses that concern them. I don't intend to define who rarely heard voices are, because I suspect we'll hear a lot about that today. But are they any of these groups, including academics, facing degree restructures? Do we ever get heard? I puzzled about this for some time until on Friday night I saw the social commentator, Father Frank Brennan. He's a rarely heard voice, but he's a powerful voice, and he only uses his voice when he's got a large issue to talk about. And of course, just as I decided to use him as an example, yesterday he appeared in the Australian with an op-ed about the religious discrimination bill. So he picks his time and he picks an important venue in which to talk about his issues. Some crucial questions for rarely heard voices. Are their outputs actually noted by people, and do they generate outcomes like changes in awareness, knowledge, and behaviour? Much of what I've got to say today is going to come from this book, which is out next year. And I suspect that I'm going to outrage and annoy a few academics and practitioners with what I have to say. So please chuck rocks if you feel like you need to chuck rocks. So strategic communication is at best a translucent concept, both in academia and in practice. Do we really know what it is? It's often, the term is often misapplied in reality. To what in reality is really technical and tactical communication. It's usually about outputs, not outcomes. It's focused on current timeframes. It's not about creating dialogue. It's practice that doesn't deal with mid and long-term socio-economic and political issues. Thus, technical communication is often described as media relations strategy, social media strategy, and political communication strategy, instead of recognizing these as tools or tactics that help enact a planned strategic approach to solving issues. My proposition is that we should reimagine strategic communication planning and implementation in a new dimension and integrate it with strategic business planning, and more about that shortly. This integration is beyond the normative concept of integrated marketing communication. And at the session later today, I'll have something to say about integrated marketing communication. This new communications dimension is not about the promotion of products and services, nor about immediate issues and crises. It is about the need for organisations to identify and deal with mid and long-term issues. Being strategic in communication practice is not just using basic tools that define the technical alchemy of modern practice, nor is it some renamed variant of marketing communication. It is an important agenda-setting discipline in its own right. It's time-defined planning and implementation. And in my view, it should be planned with business strategy, not integrated with, although if it's planned with business strategy, it'll end up being integrated, of course. But it deals with issues beyond the market. It's about maintaining, developing and protecting stakeholder relationships, reputations, and credibility. Now, this comes from some research that I was engaged in. I used a cohort of purposely selected senior practitioners. We ran an online quantitative questionnaire, and I did some face-to-face interviews with 14 purposely selected practitioners. Some brief demographics about that. There was a 50-50 gender balance. All of the people who participated in the study were practitioners with decision-making authority, and all sectors were represented. 100% of the people in that research assessed issues on the basis of how they impact on current business activities. Excuse me, less than half were involved in predicting how issues might occur in the long term, that is beyond 5 years. They were more often concerned about issues of reputation, values and credibility and relationships with stakeholders. The numbers in this slide and the later one look a bit odd. The software that I used, which was SurveyMonkey, if you ask people to rate in a range of 1 to 10, which is the most important, 1 being the most important, it'll give you a rating average lower than it does for those who say that 10 for not at all important. So that's why they look a bit odd there. Females, in my view, from this research, are far more strategic in the way they look at issues and strategic communication than are males. They tend to want to look at long-term issues more than issues that impact immediately. And the people in this cohort suggested that the things that drive their strategic communication are, again, reputation, values and credibility and relationships with stakeholders. This research raised a couple of problems that I've tried to address today and in other stuff. Practitioners, despite acknowledging the need for strategic approaches to communication, are often unable to do that. And they're often prevented from doing that by their clients or senior managers who are not convinced that strategic communication is important as a high order and value added function to their organisations. They recognise the need for strategic business planning, but don't accept the strategic communication imperative of dealing with mid to long-term socio-economic and political issues. So the main theme for this new invention I'm talking about is that mid and long-term socio-economic and political issues are the issues that actually affect reputation, credibility and stakeholder relationships. And they should be more strategically identified, analysed and managed. And if we really think about this, the problem is that they cannot be adequately addressed and resolved in current timeframes. You can't fix a broken reputation today, as the former Attorney General Porter has discovered. Strategic communication imperative means that higher level practice, means higher level practice that actually transcends day-to-day marketing communication, and it means engaging in dialogues with stakeholders about important emerging issues and their potential resolution before they turn into crises. The space for that is beyond the market environment. These two, I have trouble pronouncing the first name, so I'll just call them these two, argue that there's a paradigm shift needed here. Today, communication's about issues and topics, not about organisations. It's issues and topics that are at the centre of communication. And they say that that's a paradigm shift from organisation-centred focus on relationship management towards monitoring dialogue on issue arenas that are outside the organisation's control. I'm talking about an organisation's market environment and an organisation's non-market environment. Lots of people have written about this, but the piece I like most is by Bark and Allen, which was published in 2010. In an organisation's non-market environment, it's about selling products and services. In the non-market environment, it's about dynamic public policy and issue debates. Activists in this sense can be us as academics, can be environmentalists and so on, as that list shows. The marketing communications realm, in my view, is the market environment, selling product. Strategic communication, in my view, is what happens in this environment, the external environment beyond the market environment, the non-market environment, so described. The non-market environment, of course, is akin to Habermas's public sphere and the issue arenas or places of interaction that those two talk about. It's the space where dominant coalitions and practitioners need to understand opportunities and threats that issues arising in that non-market environment pose to their organisations. It's an issue arena where organisations and stakeholders deal with multiple common issues. And those two argue that as academics and as practitioners, we should focus on identifying the different issues that face organisations and issue dynamics before trying to define who our stakeholders or target publics are. Excuse me, dealing with issues in the non-market environment involves discursive social practice, in which activist organisations, practitioners, are social actors defining and influencing issues. It's an attempt to influence outcomes. It's a dynamic area. Boundaries of issue debates change as they are influenced by the contributions of new people who join the debate or of others who refine their arguments. And issues that are not solved in the non-market environment have great potential to harm market performance. So, mid and long-term issues not identified and addressed here in the mid and long terms eventually impact on business performance in the market environment. I've proposed a new definition, and I won't read it out, you can read it there, but basically it says that strategic communication is planned and purposeful mid to long-term communication in which we act as social actors, discursively managing reputation, values and credibility by maintaining relationships with stakeholders about the dynamic issues that take place in non-market policy and non-market environments. How might that work? I'm suggesting that we integrate with strategic business planning. Baghai and his colleagues, American management academics, proposed that businesses should plan in 3 horizons. Now, the midterm, which is out to 5 years, the long term or beyond 5 years. They proposed that in Horizon 1, organisations are doing stuff that defends, extends and increases profitability of existing businesses, marketing communications role. In Horizon 2, they're resourcing initiatives that will help them to build new businesses. And in the long-term horizon, they're uncovering options for future opportunities and placing bets on selected options. Think about that in terms of electric vehicles and how long ago companies, automotive manufacturing companies, started to think about electric vehicles. So how might that apply to strategic communication? Well, in the current horizon, I'm suggesting that this is boundary spanning, environmental scanning, day-to-day media relations, crisis comms, marketing communication. In the midterm, Horizon 2, issue identification, building stakeholder relationships again, policy development and lobbying, and specific project communication. And for the long term, Horizon 3, that is beyond 5 years, working out what issues we need to identify and analyse for longer term strategic communication, strategic stakeholder relationships and persistent government and community relationships. What are the implications for rarely heard voices? I'm suggesting that whether they're individuals or whether they're groups, they need to understand that issues are dynamic and that other influencers are likely to join in and change the parameters of the debates that they get involved in. Recognise the arena in which debates occur, that is the non-market environment. Important socio-economic and political issues. Identify and target the social actors who are going to debate you in the non-market arena, who share or are concerned with issues. There's a suggestion of Jim Grooning around that, and use tactical and technical tools in line with strategy, not instead of strategy. Boom, boom. I beat you.
Well done. I did actually give you the 2-minute warning. I'm not sure if you saw it, but thanks, Jim. Perfect. Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. If we could hold any questions for Jim, feel free to put them in the chat line. But we'll go on to our next speaker, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions after that. So our next speaker is actually Victoria Fielding, who is going to discuss some very thorough and amazing research that she has done into the news marketplace of ideas. So Victoria, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, so my name is Victoria Fielding. I'm from the University of Adelaide. I did my PhD at UniSA with the wonderful Leanne as my supervisor, and I also want to acknowledge Colette Snowden, who's on the Zoom, who was my other supervisor. So I'm an early career researcher, and I'm currently in the process of publishing from my PhD. And I'm interdisciplinary in the sense that I look at the impact of communication on news media. And interestingly enough, just to start, I thought it would be interesting for you all to know that I'm actually at 2 conferences at once at the moment. I'm presenting at JERA, the Journalism Education Research Association conference this afternoon. And I guess that they sort of see me as on the dark side in PR. Most journalism academics come from journalism backgrounds, but I come from a communication background. And I wanted to understand the influence of political communication on news media to understand how journalists represent political deliberation and how that actually works in practice. So my topic today is communication inequality in the news marketplace of ideas. Thank you for that beautiful welcome to country at the start of the presentation. I'd like to also begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the Kaurna land on which I'm presenting today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also extend respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples attending the conference. So today I'm going to start by talking about how my research addresses gaps in PR research by looking at competing political narratives. I'll also explain how my research is informing journalism research by talking about frame building and how that's relevant to political communicators who are news sources who are trying to influence what James referred to as the public sphere and I refer to as the marketplace of ideas. I'll then show you very briefly the results of my PhD research, which found during an industrial dispute that the employer's narrative was advantaged in the news marketplace of ideas. And I'm going to introduce the union's strategic response, which was defensive counter narratives, and the implications of those for PR practitioners. So I'm not sure if anyone has seen Squid Games, but I thought that this picture of one of the games they played, it's a brilliant show if you haven't seen it on Netflix, of the tug of war was actually really relevant to understanding the way that strategic communicators compete in the news marketplace of ideas. And they're competing not just for attention, but also to have their arguments legitimated in news media. So in the game, you have to win the tug of war, and the one that loses is actually pulled off the platform to, ultimate death. And really in news media, communicators are competing to have their ideas actually presented to mass audiences as credible, as legitimate, to build their reputation and to actually have the public accept their points of view. So it's an incredibly high stakes game for political communicators. So within this competition, it's usually assumed that there are 2 sides, but I've actually identified a new category of strategic communication, which is called a defensive counter narrative. And I'm going to explain how I came to find that. So I contribute to public relations and communications scholarship. One of the ways that I do that is by talking about framing theory in the context of strategic frames and their influence on news frames. So most framing research actually looks at the frames in news media and not enough look at why those frames are used and where they came from. And I look at the way that strategic communication frames influence the news media framing of political and industrial and social contestation. There's also some theorists who suggest that more needs to be known about public relations in political sphere. We know that communication is central to politics. We often talk about, you know, the political public relations strategies of politicians. I mean, everyone's heard Scotty from marketing critiqued, and I've as someone who has a background in has a marketing degree originally, I find it really interesting that we talk about him as being a marketer when really I think he's a PR person. He's he's spinning to try to inform his version of the world in news media. He does that very well. There's also not enough research that is focused on why frames are stronger than each other or why they compete, how they compete. Although we know that there are 2 or more sided framing contests, it's very hard to understand why one would actually bias news representation ahead of another. And related to that, more needs to be understood about how power imbalance impacts the stakeholders' outcomes in news media framing. And to understand that, I thought looking at industrial dispute reporting in a politicised context was really important because obviously an employer has more power structurally than workers who are marginalised within a workplace sort of industrial dispute through their roles in that organisation. And so it's a really useful way to understand how power imbalance might influence the news marketplace of ideas and the outcomes for news media framing. So I used a model of frame building, which is really mostly concerned with how news media frames information during political contestation. So everyone knows Entman's seminal framing theory, which is information made salient in news text, including problem definitions, causal interpretations, moral evaluations, and treatment recommendations. Out of understanding that there are frames in news media, there's been a lot of interest in news research into how frames are built, so frame building. And Entman, Matt, and Pellicano actually proposed this model of diachronic framing process model. Very briefly, they suggest that frames start within culture, and I add ideology to that, that they then, the most dominant frames will influence the strategic communicators. So in the case of my research, the employer and the union in competition to influence news media framing of that dispute. So it's a bit like that tug of war that I was talking about, that the strategic communicators are in competition with each other to try to influence news media framing in their favour during political contestation. I've also added to framing theory that frames can be perceived as narratives. And that has quite important implications for strategic communicators. So narratives are made up of heroes, villains, and victims. And I found that lots of scholars agree that narratives, particularly industrial narratives, oppose each other because they are the industrial arguments of opposing interests or opposing ideologies. So you've got a picture there on the screen of someone who's two-faced. I thought that was a great sort of visual to represent that it's not just important how, say, a union leader is framed in the news in terms of how many times they're mentioned, but also what their characterization is. So where the employer will frame the union as a villain, the workers will frame the union leader as a hero. And so the same person can actually have different characterizations, and they obviously want to influence the characterization. So they're more likely the hero, maybe the victim, but definitely not the villain. And so I actually worked out you can trace the use of these characters in strategic narratives into the news media to see which strategic narrative is having more influence or is more likely sort of framing the news media coverage of that contestation. So I'm going to show you the results of my research very briefly, but I used that diachronic framing process model to first look at the culture and ideology of trade unionism in Australia through 5 historical discourse moments, news reports, all the way back to the shearer strike. I also then applied my understanding of what frames existed in culture and ideology to the framing competition between CFA Management in Victoria and the United Firefighters Union, who in 2016 had a very public industrial dispute that was highly politicised, with the Liberal and National parties supporting the employer in their negotiations, in their arguments against signing the EBA, and an enterprise bargaining agreement, and the union being supported by the Labor Party. And so those two groups had their own strategic narratives which opposed each other, and I traced the characters in those narratives quantitatively into news media reporting about the dispute to try to understand which had more influence and try to theorise about why that was. So in the ideology and culture of trade unionism, I found there are two stories or two meta-narratives. Meta-narratives really underpin the ideological arguments that are used by strategic communicators to assert their authority, to assert their legitimacy, to manage their reputations, to put forth their arguments in the marketplace of ideas. So I found that the employer's story is the default story that I found was used in news reporting of industrial disputes. And I called this the authority story. This fit with the CFA management story that the union were actually taking over the CFA. You might remember that industrial dispute that the employer constantly was saying hands off the CFA. And the way they were framing the union was that the union and the workers were acting inappropriately in trying to use the EBA to collectively negotiate for the better working conditions, mostly around safety. And framing those workers as insubordinate to the legitimate authority, and therefore ruining or damaging the organisation by intervening in the natural authority. And so that authority story I found is really, really strong in our culture and ideology by privileging the powerful voice of the employer, that their sort of authority should be not disrupted, because that would have bad consequences, not just for the organisation, but really importantly for the national interest as well. There is an alternative story, which I find is the more marginalised story. However, there were industrial disputes in the news, sort of framing history that did actually eventually use this narrative, including, say, the waterfront dispute. So this is the empathy story that unions use to actually argue for the legitimacy of collective action in a workplace and the benefits of workers having a say in their conditions of employment. In particular, the UFU union used that empathy narrative to argue that if they had a say in their working conditions, they could make their workplace more safe. And so I called it the safety story. So tracing the characterizations, I actually found that frame building actually happened in a two-step process, and it really didn't look like that competition had a level playing field. The reason for that was that journalists, in their vast majority, told the story of the authority meta-narrative, and once they'd adopted that story, they actually selected, emphasised and included information that fit that story. So this is what it looked like quantitatively. 86.62% of the news narrative aligned with the CFA's takeover story, the CFA management's takeover story. Only 3.7 told the safety story, which is the empathy perspective. And I discovered a new type of framing or a new type of strategic narrative, which I called the defensive counter narrative. So from this graph, you can see how I've quantified the strategic communication used by the union and their allies in the Labor Party. So the red shows that they did argue for the safety narrative. They framed themselves as mistreated by the employer for not caring about their safety. They framed the community as threatened. They framed themselves as gutsy heroes doing really dangerous work. But for the most part, they actually used the defensive counter narrative in yellow. They framed themselves as victims of a political witch hunt. Labor in particular framed themselves as pragmatic for trying to bring the dispute, which had been ongoing for 3 years, to an end, saying it had been going on too long. And they framed the Liberal government as intervening quite heartlessly to try to oppose the union. And so this was defending against accusations that they were trying to take over this CFA. So where the safety narrative was used strategically to justify the legitimacy of the EBA and to suggest that it was going to improve safety, I found the defensive counter narrative was used to defend against accusations of illegitimacy. So they'd been framed as the villain, and they were told, if they, the employer was telling everyone they were trying to illegitimately take over the CFA, and the union was and the Labor Party were defending against that accusation. I found there were 3 reasons that this defensive counter-narrative was used, and this was very much informed not just by what the strategic communicators said, but extensive interviews with stakeholders involved in the dispute. I found that unions are naturally defensive in their relationship with media, who they see as part of the capitalist corporate class. I also found that the union sort of understood or assumed that their inability to use their safety narrative meant they needed to resort to defending themselves against the takeover narrative. And related to that, the defensive counter-narrative was more likely to gain media attention as it fit within the takeover story. And so they actually were incentivized to defend themselves because of the dominance of that takeover story and the empathy one basically just bouncing off, not having any influence. So just to finish up, the implications of defensive counter-narratives is that, in fact, quite a lot of research, including Lakoff, who's a seminal scholar in communication framing in politics, counter-narratives might have actually reinforced the strength of the takeover narrative by implying that the union had accusations to answer to. Oh, I've got an echo. So this means that coming back to the whole basic topic of this conference, when you're marginalised in framing competition, when your voice isn't actually able to be heard, defensive counter-narratives may actually reinforce your marginalisation because you're not actually able to tell your own story in the marketplace of ideas. And Johnson-Carty refers to this as symbolic annihilation. So instead of actually arguing for your own legitimacy, by arguing against accusations that you are acting illegitimacy, you're actually making that dominant story that opposes, your very existence stronger in news media framing, which has really important implications for the long-term legitimacy of trade unionism, because every dispute that illegitimizes the union is actually illegitimizing the entire concept of collective action and unionism within that dominant sort of authority frame. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you so much for being on time too. So what a fantastic start to our day today, taking the big picture first and not focusing on necessarily individual voices, but looking at the environment in which those voices are trying to be heard. So I'd like to open up to a few minutes of questions for Jim and Victoria. And I'm happy to take them. You can unmute your mic and ask that way if you wish.
That's good.
Yeah, all very quiet. I think you've stunned a few people.
Leanne, it's Rob Masters here. Just with Victoria's analysis there, I assume when she refers to narratives, are you talking there about the arguments they're putting forward, or are you talking about the strategy they're putting forward? And secondly, the takeover argument of the unions to the CFA was a political initiative by the Victorian Labor government supporting the MFB or the union, and that was the motivator behind that. So did that come out? I noticed in one of your graphs you put in political influence, but did that come out? The real political influence was the support of the Labor government of the union to take over the CFA, because the CFA has a very, very long history of mismanagement, and the Labor government put in place a chief executive or chair of the board, actually, who was a Labor supporter. So the board had a huge influence in that debate as well.
Yeah, so I guess just going to your first question, when I talked to the stakeholders, it was absolutely seen as a very political narrative. But when an employer opposes union intervention, I guess they would call it, that's always political. So it really came to me sort of about halfway through my analysis that it's assumed that unions are being strategically sort of political when they're arguing or using narratives to justify why they're involved in this dispute. But it's not assumed that the employer is being political. The employer's position is taken for granted. And the reason it's taken for granted, I argue, is because it's seen as entirely legitimate within our culture that an employer would oppose collective action in a workplace. So, going back to the MFB has had a really antagonistic view towards unionism for as long as the MFB has existed. The United Firefighters Union has been around for over 100 years, and they have been fighting for better conditions for, in the workplace and have been resisted by the MFB for all that time. And really what the CFA management was doing was trying to avoid having the same MFB conditions transferred into the CFA, even though the CFA firefighters were doing exactly the same job as the MFB firefighters. And so they're a very sort of militarized sort of culture in the fire services that, one command and control, and anyone who intervenes in that is going to break the whole system. And so, I guess we say things like they're trying to bust the union influence, but that's taken for granted in news framing. It's taken for granted that the employer would oppose safety clauses because they don't want their control taken away from them, but it's not taken for granted that the workers would do that. So I guess the last thing I'll say is that even within the culture of, I guess, unionism, because I spend a lot of time speaking with, and working with people in that area, the illegitimacy of collective action has been so sort of accepted that even, unionists themselves are very scared to take industrial action because it's framed as so illegitimate. And that has had really terrible consequences for the union movement over the last sort of 30 to 40 years during the rise of neoliberalism.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm going to have to quickly shift the debate so we can get on to the next session, but there are just a couple of questions there for Jim from